Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
During Easter dinner, my brother stretched his voice across the table like he always does when he wants every conversation to orbit him. And he gave the usual performance about product launches and leadership offsites and how his calendar looks like an air traffic map because he is apparently indispensable. And when someone asked how I was doing, he smirked and said I was still playing with my little projects, and I swallowed the heat that rose in my chest because I have learned that letting him believe I am harmless is sometimes the sharpest tool I own. And if you are wondering how we got to the moment when Grandma asked why my name was on the acquisition deal, just know that it started right there, with me deciding to let him talk. I could feel the room leaning toward him the way it always has, because my parents still measure worth by titles and headcount and how many strangers wear the company hoodie you hand out at conferences. And because my aunt reads the business section like it is a church bulletin and repeats whatever the loudest man at her office says about the stock market. And because my brother learned very young that if he speaks first and loudest, people confuse volume with truth. So he ran the same play and it worked, and for a while I let my fork move slowly and I nodded as if he was teaching us something, even as he took little jabs about how I must enjoy all the free time that comes from not being mission critical. He said something about how risky it is to jump from idea to idea without committing to a real ladder, and he glanced at me as if he was doing me a favor by saying it in front of everyone. And my mother made that thoughtful face she uses when she wants to look neutral while choosing a side, and I felt the familiar urge to defend the years I kept my mouth shut and built something boring but sturdy. And the longer urge to say that not every ladder is worth climbing if it leans against the wrong building, yet I stayed quiet because I have learned that the person who needs the room the most is the person I never need to beat head-on. When the ham was passed and the rolls did their route and the kids disappeared down the hall with their candy, he pivoted to salaries and equity and how hard it is to hire good people. And he dropped a number he thought would stun the table and then added that he is generous with referrals and could probably help me find something more stable if I got tired of chasing shiny things. And he said it in that helpful tone that only people who need to be superior can carry without choking, and the table laughed the way families laugh when the punchline requires someone to be small. I took a slow breath and I asked him, gently, what he loved most about the product his team shipped last quarter, because I wanted to hear him talk about something real. And he launched into a word salad about roadmaps and go-to-market and velocity that managed to avoid saying what the thing actually did, and I realized, not for the first time, that his power lives mostly in the costumes of confidence. And that once you strip away the acronyms, you are left with a man who learned to bluff and never had to show his cards, and for a second I felt sorry for him, but the feeling passed. Grandma watched this without picking a side, just the way she watched every school concert and every graduation and every awkward holiday when someone pretended not to be hurt, and while my brother warmed up for another victory lap, I reached for my water and, under the edge of the table, I opened my phone and skimmed the email that had arrived an hour earlier from our council with a final, very plain sentence that said the signatures were complete and the announcement would post after the weekend, and there was a simple question about whether the credit for strategic lead should appear as my full name or my initials, and in that tiny choice I felt years of being misread gathering into one clean point. I locked the screen and let the conversation pass over me like a wave that had already crested, and when my aunt asked me, with that bright curiosity she saves for gossip, whether I had anything exciting going on, I smiled and said that I was mostly tired and mostly grateful and trying very hard to make fewer predictions about the year, which was true in its own way, and my brother chuckled and said that was a nice way to say nothing, and he said it kindly, which is somehow worse. So I asked him how he handles pressure at work when something mission critical is on fire and all the executives are watching the dashboard, and he answered with more jargon that sounded like courage if you did not listen too closely, and I nodded again. And I let the room keep him warm, and I kept my hands steady on my napkin while my mind stepped out of the noise and into the steady hallway where grown decisions live, because revenge, at least the kind I can live with, is not about shouting in a dining room. It is about choosing the timing that makes the truth undeniable without ever saying the ugly part out loud. When the pie was served and the coffee smelled strong and my brother leaned back to accept his praise, I slid my phone a little farther under the napkin and typed a single line to our counsel that confirmed my full name for the announcement and approved the distribution list that included the business desk of the local paper my grandmother actually reads. Then I hit send and turned the phone face down and asked my brother to pass the sugar, and he did, and he smiled, and he had no idea that the kindest thing I could do for both of us was exactly what I had just done, which was to let him keep the floor while I set the clock. When people ask how a family ends up with one child who is framed as the safe bet and another who is framed as the experiment, I think about the way adults reward certainty even when it is shallow and punish ambiguity even when it is brave. And I remember being the kid who loved starting things while my brother loved finishing them, which meant teachers and relatives lined up to tell him how reliable he was while looking at me like a cautionary tale, and because that story kept repeating. Through birthdays and graduations and holidays, it hardened into a routine where he spoke first and last, and I learned to build my life in the spaces between his monologues, only stepping out when the result would be big enough that even the people who pretended not to see would have to adjust their faces. It was not that I failed or wandered without purpose, it was that I refused to perform success in the exact costume everyone recognized. And while he collected badges with the right logos and posted photos from conferences where everyone wore the same smile and the same jacket, I did the boring work that never photographs well, registering a company that no one could pronounce at first, wiring small retainers to lawyers who did not bother returning calls for weeks, teaching myself which vendors will bleed you out slowly and which ones simply overcharge you once and then show up when you need them, and I kept spreadsheets that would make my mother yawn and my aunt roll her eyes because there were no buzzwords in them, only cash and calendar and consequence. And there was a kind of clean pride in understanding exactly what I could afford to break and what I could not. He liked to explain my life back to me in the tone of a mentor who believes he is being generous, and I let him do it because arguing with him cost more energy than it ever returned. And also because I learned that silence is not surrender when you are using it to save power for the move that matters. So when he called my projects cute or said I should pick one thing and climb a real ladder, I heard the boy who once made me wait in the parking lot during his victory lap after a school event. And I filed the memory next to a quiet promise that I would never again ask him to translate my worth for an audience that liked easy answers. Our parents did not set out to choose sides, but the way they praised him for being steady and praised me for being resilient told me everything about what they thought was possible for each of us. And while he leaned into that applause, I leaned into the freedom that comes from being underestimated, because underestimation lets you make moves in plain sight without anyone reaching to stop your hand. Which is how I built a product that solved a dull problem for a specific kind of mid-market operator who does not post online but signs checks, and I kept my name light in public and heavy in the contracts, so that when people searched for proof they found very little, and when it mattered there were signatures that could not be argued with. There were small humiliations that I still remember, not because they broke me but because they were practice. Like the time he put an arm around my shoulder at Thanksgiving and told a room full of relatives that I was a creative spirit who would make a great team mascot for any startup that needed energy. And I smiled and poured coffee and made sure that the person who heard me most was the quiet uncle who once served as a trustee for a community foundation and who later introduced me to the kind of lawyer who only answers emails that are short, specific, and accompanied by money, which is how I learned to write emails that close loops rather than start debates. Grandma watched all of this without fuss and without lectures, asking me the sort of plain questions that only people who have seen enough life know how to ask, the kind that keep you honest because they do not reward performance. And I started calling her on Sunday evenings to talk about nothing in particular until she mentioned a small problem with a bank account and a longer problem with a property tax bill, and I fixed both without turning it into a parade, and in return she gave me something no one else in that house seemed able to offer, which was trust that did not require a presentation deck. So when the acquisition began to look real and the documents started to read like a foreign language written by tired adults, I knew exactly who would understand the meaning of quiet signatures landing on the right page. The deal that will become the line in the paper did not fall from the sky or appear because I manifested it while journaling about confidence. It happened because I told a steady buyer the truth about what our product could do and what it could never do. And I let them watch us fail and fix a thing in front of them without pretending it was painless. And when their counsel asked who had authority to bind the company, I did not pretend it was a committee. I used my own name because I own the consequences, and that simple detail is the part that will make the room change temperature when the announcement runs. Not because I need the applause, but because the narrative that has protected my brother for years requires the belief that I am a side character in my own work. At this table, while he performs a version of success that was designed to impress the kind of audience that claps for buzzwords, I open a quiet message thread with our communications lead and I confirm, in the calmest language I have ever written, that the release will include a community grant in my grandmother's name funded from my closing proceeds, a grant that will pay off the small debts of seniors in our county starting with property taxes and pharmacy bills, and I ask that the local paper get the exclusive because they have always treated community news like it matters, and I attach a 2-sentence bio that does not mention awards or panels. And I add one request, that the headline use my full name with the same middle initial my grandmother uses on the checks she sends to cousins when they hit a rough patch. If you think that is petty, you are welcome to call it that, yet I do not experience it as pettiness so much as calibration, because I am not interested in embarrassing him with a speech or proving I can talk louder. I am interested in changing the room with a fact that cannot be argued into something smaller, and the most precise way to do that is to make the moment belong to the person who has always seen me clearly, which is why the dedication is in her name and not mine, and why I am comfortable letting him keep the sound while I keep the outcome. I sit back while the laughter loops around the table, and I can feel the little click in my chest that happens when a plan moves from intention to schedule. And I think about the girl I was who begged to be taken seriously and the woman I am who has learned to withhold the explanation until it buys something useful. And I know the breaking point is coming because men like my brother cannot resist reaching for one last jab when they sense attention drifting, and when he does I will not raise my voice or list my achievements. I will simply let the clock run until a certain paper lands on a certain porch, at which point I will only need one sentence, and it will not be mine. By the time dessert plates had been cleared and the children had grown restless enough to scatter into the living room with their candy baskets, my brother had gained the full attention of the table once again. And as he leaned back with his glass in hand, he shifted into a story about the stress of managing a team that apparently cannot function without him, emphasizing how exhausting it is to constantly clean up after junior employees who do not understand deadlines, and then, almost as though he could not resist the temptation of reminding everyone where he thinks I stand, he turned his head toward me and, with the same smirk he has been polishing since high school, remarked that at least I am free from that kind of responsibility, since none of my so-called ventures ever last long enough to require a team to manage. The laughter that followed was not malicious in the way a bully circle of friends might laugh on a playground, but it was sharp enough to sting, because it carried the weight of dismissal disguised as casual humor. The kind of sound families make when they are uncomfortable with tension, but willing to trade someone's dignity for a moment of relief. And as I forced a small smile while pressing my palms flat against my thighs under the table, I felt that familiar pull in my chest. The one that begged me to finally stand up and correct the record, to announce in clear and unforgiving language that not only had my projects lasted, but one of them had outgrown his entire career before he even saw it coming. I thought about the years I had let him narrate my life to others, about the way he had positioned himself as the mentor I never asked for, and about the silent looks exchanged between aunts and cousins whenever he made another joke about my supposed instability, and I realized that the weight of those unspoken judgments had trained me to rehearse explanations in my head that I never delivered, because I believed that silence would one day serve me better than a loud rebuttal in the wrong moment. And as he grinned across the table waiting for me to either laugh along or flinch, I chose silence again, but this time not as an act of surrender, this time as an act of patience. What no one at that table knew, what even he could not have imagined, Was that less than 24 hours earlier I had signed the final piece of paperwork that would bind my name to a deal large enough to change not just my future, but the way our family would ever again speak about me. And the strangest part was that I had not yet fully processed it myself, so when his words cut across the table like they always had, instead of breaking me, they confirmed just how invisible my progress had been to him, and I realized that invisibility, once weaponized, could be devastating. As the conversation shifted to another cousin's new apartment, I let myself replay the closing call in my mind, the one where their counsel asked me to confirm the spelling of my full name for the announcement. And I remembered how calm my voice sounded when I answered, how ordinary it felt to agree to something extraordinary, and how I had immediately thought of my grandmother's face when she would eventually read it in her morning paper. Because unlike the rest of them, she has never demanded a polished story from me. She has only asked whether I was doing the work I wanted to be doing, and in that moment I promised myself that the reveal would not come from my mouth, but from hers, casually, innocently, in the middle of a family conversation where he least expected it. The urge to snap back at him was strong, because his jab had been precise enough to trigger every insecurity that had once kept me awake at night, and I could have easily leaned across the table and told him about the acquisition, about the valuation, about the names of the executives who had sat across from me and treated me as an equal, but that would have been the kind of instant gratification that fades as quickly as the sugar on the pie crust, and I wanted something permanent, something that would not just silence him for a minute, but shift the entire family's frame of reference for good, and the only way to achieve that was to let him keep talking until the universe handed me the perfect delivery mechanism. So I lifted my glass and congratulated him on his latest promotion, and I told him sincerely that managing people is harder than most will ever admit. And I saw the satisfaction flicker across his face as he believed he had both silenced me and won the round. But inside, I was already moving pieces on a board he did not even realize existed. Because while he was busy counting his small audience's laughs, I was counting down to the moment when his voice would crack under the weight of a truth he had no way to spin. As the plates were stacked and the children returned begging for ice cream, I felt that peculiar calm that comes when you know you could lash out but choose not to, when you know that the fight you are refusing in the moment is actually the setup for a much bigger strike later. And I leaned back and let my brother's words echo around the table, because I knew that the very arrogance keeping him smug tonight was the same blindness that would make his silence tomorrow so much sweeter. And as I folded my napkin across my lap and looked down at the empty plate in front of me, I realized that every small humiliation I had endured in that house had been fuel for this exact moment, and that the breaking point had already passed. Because what none of them knew, not even him, was that my silence was not weakness, it was the sound of victory arriving on its own schedule. The strange thing about silence, when you wield it long enough, is that it begins to change shape from something others mistake as weakness into something more like a waiting game. And as the Easter dinner moved into that stage where coffee was poured and half of the table tried to convince themselves they still had room for dessert, I could feel the shift beginning in small, almost imperceptible ways. Because while my brother continued to ride the wave of his own self-congratulation, repeating stories from work that blurred together into a soup of buzzwords and self-importance, there was a new undercurrent in the room, a sense that not everyone was laughing quite as hard as they had an hour earlier. Not everyone was leaning forward to catch every word. And in those subtle changes, I felt the build-up towards something neither of us could stop. My grandmother sat 2 chairs down, quiet as she always is when conversations turn into contests, stirring her coffee slowly. And I noticed her eyes flick between me and my brother in the way of someone who has already guessed a secret, but is waiting for the right moment to confirm it. And though she said nothing, her silence was the kind that carried weight. The kind that pressed lightly against me as if to say, you do not have to do the work of unveiling, because sooner or later truth walks into a room even without an invitation. Meanwhile, my brother, oblivious to currents that do not flatter him, launched into another comparison, this time about how some people in life cling to ideas that never scale while others, like him, know how to operate on levels that actually matter. And while he did not use my name, the way his eyes glanced toward me every few seconds told the table exactly who he meant, and though the sting of the implication would once have made me defensive, now I found myself strangely calm, almost amused. Because what he believed to be cutting was, in reality, evidence of how little he knew, not just about my work, but about the fact that his certainty was minutes away from collapse. I said almost nothing, and when I did speak it was only to ask small, precise questions, the kind of questions that sound like interest, but are actually designed to expose the fact that beneath his loud words there is very little substance. And each time I asked him to clarify what exactly his product solved or what made his last quarter's success different from the ones before, his answers grew more circular, more laced with terms that only impress people who do not understand them, and as the circle of his logic wound tighter, I watched certain relatives begin to nod less enthusiastically, their smiles flattening, as if they too were realizing that volume and confidence are not the same as depth. But it was not my goal to embarrass him directly. It never had been, because embarrassing him outright would only make the family defend him, since that is the role they are most comfortable playing, protecting the golden son from feeling small. And that is why I chose, instead, to keep my tone soft, to let him perform until he was bloated on his own pride, because I knew that what would sting him most was not my words, but the sudden absence of a script he could control once someone else, someone unexpected, brought my name into the room with the kind of authority even he could not challenge. So I asked about nothing more dramatic than whether the pie was homemade or store-bought, and I smiled when my aunt admitted she had cheated and bought it from the bakery downtown, and I listened to the laughter ripple lightly around the table again. And in that moment I thought of the email thread that was, even then, being queued for distribution, the one that would by morning plant my name firmly in the business section of the local paper, right beneath the story about Easter services and high school baseball, and I knew my grandmother, who still reads her news in print with a pencil for circling names she knows, would be the first to spot it. Which meant she would also be the one to deliver it to this table with the kind of casualness that makes revelations sting most. I caught her looking at me once more, the tiniest smile in the corner of her mouth, and I knew that she had either already seen something online or perhaps had heard a whisper from someone in her circle of friends. Because older women have a way of keeping tabs on local news long before it is official, and I realized that she was not just a bystander in this dynamic, but the quiet arbiter. The one person who could shift the family's perception of me not through argument or presentation, but through a single sentence delivered as if it were simply an observation, not a judgment. My brother, of course, had no idea, and that was the sweetest part, because while he expanded on the challenges of working with executives who demand results without understanding the grind, while he sprinkled in names of cities he had visited and numbers that sounded important but melted on inspection, while he tried to turn every silence into applause, he did not notice that the tide of attention was ebbing away from him. Nor did he notice that I had stopped even pretending to be wounded by his remarks, because I was no longer playing the role of the sibling defending her choices. I was now the quiet center of gravity waiting for the right word to tilt the room. By the time the plates were cleared for good and my mother stood to gather leftovers, the evening had settled into that lull where people were full, tired, and slightly less alert, and it was in that softened space that my grandmother leaned forward, her spoon resting against the edge of her cup, and in a voice no louder than any of her ordinary questions, she asked if the acquisition deal she had read about that morning was the reason my name was on the announcement, and, just like that, the build-up was complete, because the silence that followed was thick enough to stop my brother mid-breath, heavy enough to hang over the table like a stone, and I did not even need to look at him to know that for the first time in years, he had nothing rehearsed to say. When my grandmother asked, in that plain voice she reserves for the questions that matter, whether the acquisition deal she read that morning was the reason my name sat in the opening paragraph, the sound around the table thinned in a way I have only ever felt in hospital hallways and court waiting rooms, because people who are used to hearing one version of a story do not know what to do when the door opens and a different narrator walks in. And, before anyone could turn to me for a denial or a small joke to keep the peace, I said yes, as simply as I could say it, and then I let the yes sit there without decoration, because no add-on could do more damage to a script than silence doing its quiet work. My brother reached for a sentence that did not arrive, which would have been funny if it were not such a familiar ache. And he blinked as if he had missed a cue while the cousins looked at their plates and my aunt tried to figure out whether to congratulate me or ask for proof. And I kept my face steady because I had already decided that if I made this moment about gloating, I would only teach them that I still needed their permission to be whole. So I thanked my grandmother for reading the paper, and I told her the line she circled was accurate and that I was proud of the team we built, and then I stopped, because the point was never to impress them, it was to remove his hobby of minimizing me from the menu. He tried to recover with a technical question, something about whether this was an acqui-hire, a word he throws around when he wants to shrink risk by naming it. And I could see him searching for a way to reframe my news as a soft landing rather than a deliberate outcome, but I had no interest in that dance, so I answered with calm specifics that did not invite further sparring, that the buyer wanted the product, the contracts, and the pipeline, that the release named me as strategic lead, because I led the negotiations, and that my team would transition on a timeline that respected the customers who had kept us alive, and then I folded my napkin across my lap again and asked if anyone wanted more coffee, because nothing weakens a bully more than a fact presented without heat. My mother reached out with a hand that trembled just enough for me to notice and asked why I had not told them sooner, and for once I did not cushion the truth with soft words. I said that telling them earlier would have turned my work into a debate I did not need, and that I wanted to arrive at this table as an adult with a result rather than as a child asking for votes, and to my surprise, she nodded the way people nod when they recognize a lesson that should have been obvious, and then she smiled in a small, unsteady way that I let myself accept without conditions. My grandmother, who had stayed quiet after her question landed, picked up her cup and, almost as an afterthought, asked if the part about a community grant in her name was a typo, and that was the place where I let myself be tender. Because this was the only audience I built the moment for, so I told her it was not a typo and that once the funds cleared the grant would quietly pay off property taxes and small pharmacy bills for seniors in our county, with names kept private unless someone chose otherwise, and I watched her eyes fill with something steadier than pride, which felt like a blessing disguised as a nod. My brother tried one more maneuver, a joke about how compensation in tech is complicated and not every deal is life-changing, and how timing can make even a strong exit feel small. And I did not let him have the last word because the last word is not the same thing as closure, so I said that what felt big to me was not the number, although I am not going to lie and pretend it does not make a difference. What felt big was choosing my own terms and keeping my name on the part that mattered and choosing to do something useful with the piece that would show up in my account, and that this choice arrived without his input, which was the part that would take him longest to accept. There was a moment when I could have reached for pettiness, when I could have reminded him of every joke and every unnecessary lesson, and every time he narrated my work to a room that did not know me, and I thought about cashing those chips. But it felt like stepping back into a house I had already left, so I did something smaller and therefore stronger. I asked him sincerely whether he was happy at work and whether he was building anything he would be proud of 10 years from now, and even though I meant the question as a gift, I watched it land like a mirror he could not put down, because for the first time in years the conversation required him to describe substance rather than repeat noise. The cousins started asking real questions, the kind that do not show up on holiday panels, about how you know when to sell, and how you protect yourself from the wrong buyer, and how you keep your voice when the room assumes you do not have one. And I answered them in full sentences without performing, because the best revenge is often a redistribution of gravity, and I wanted the younger ones to feel the room tilt toward their curiosity rather than toward his monologues, and if that bruised him, then it was a bruise he earned. When it was time to pack leftovers and put lids on containers, he helped in a daze that almost made me feel sorry for him, and then he recovered enough to pull me aside by the doorway and say he wished I had trusted him with the news earlier. And I said I will forgive the history if he stops requiring me to submit footnotes for my life, and that if he can manage that, maybe we can start over as adults who exchange respect without an audience, and he looked down at his shoes and nodded, which was not a promise, but it was at least a pause in the old pattern. I walked my grandmother to her car, and she squeezed my hand with the grip of a woman who has buried illusions and kept moving, and she said that she never doubted the work would speak when it was ready, and she asked whether the paper used the middle initial she favors. And I told her yes, and we both laughed softly because it felt like a private joke we had been building for years. And then she told me to drive safe, and to keep my accounts separate, and to call her if the buyer ever sent a letter that sounded like smoke, and I promised I would. On the drive home, I thought about how many times I had wanted to stand up in that dining room and list my qualifications until everyone surrendered, and I felt grateful that I had waited for something better than approval. Because what I got was not a round of applause, but a structural change to the story they tell when I am not in the room, and that is worth more than any toast. And as the taillights ahead of me blinked and the radio murmured, I realized that the plan had not been about humiliating him so much as about liberating myself from the need to win arguments, which is why, even with loose threads still dangling and old habits still twitching, I knew without question that I had delivered the final move. Not with a speech, but with a life that did not require one.